Hey everybody. So, this is going to be a little bit of a difficult video for those who may not be ready to really dive into the emotional nature of trauma and healing. But I feel called to do this particular video right now. So, if you are not ready to possibly feel really intense things, or to feel really intensely at all, then this is your cue to go ahead and bow out to take an exit. But if you're ready to dive right into the crucible of healing, then please stick around. So, one thing that needs to be addressed right off the bat is the fundamental physics of trauma. The psyche is subject to physics, and there is a physics to psyche. It's very clear. Everybody can see it. If you want to see it for yourself, you can see it by simply looking at thought, observing the nature of thought. The physics of trauma is that, and I'm just going to jump right into it, trauma is violence, violence is trauma, right? Those are equivocal terms. A traumatized brain, that is, a traumatized psyche, is, brace yourself, you might not like this, a traumatized psyche, right? A psyche that identifies with its trauma and clings to that trauma, right, as a consistent narrative running through one's life. That's a narcissistic psyche. The I know it's difficult, it's not easy to hear, and that's not an attack. Narcissism, what it actually is, see, every ego is narcissistic by very virtue of being an ego. An ego is a trauma based reaction against not getting what one wants or needs, right? In infancy, there's hurt, right? You get hurt, and the very fact of being hurt creates hurtness in you. And the identity, the structure that's formed around that pain, around that hurt, around that trauma, which is the wall, the border, the boundary, all the mechanisms meant to keep anything else out, is really just keeping the pain, the hurt, the suffering, the trauma in. And that very creation of that trauma-based entity, that trauma-based psychological entity, that is the narcissistic entity. And that's how the virus of trauma spreads from, what you would call from perpetrator to victim. But every perpetrator is also a victim, and every victim also becomes a perpetrator, just by very virtue of having that virus in there, because we like to think about it in terms of perpetrator victim. That's a role-based analysis in a particularly given situation. But in reality, what's happening is just a transfer of the virus from one human being to another. And so the trap, getting stuck in it, is that when being caught in that nexus, in that field, the emotion, the unhealed emotion, which is the bedrock of that identity, of that psychological structure, which one then calls me, I, myself, and carries on through life, identifying and recalling it from memory every day, modifying it slightly here and there, but it essentially always being that same wound, right? The problem of being in that state is that it can only be emotionally reactive, right? There's the perpetual, the anger, the fear, right? Hatred, self-hatred, jealousy. Since all of those qualities, right? Depression, anxiety, all of that, everything that is contained and is branched out from that very root of the pain, the trauma, the suffering, which is then being guarded and guided, gilded by the defense mechanisms, by the personality structures that are meant to keep more out, but it really just keeps that in, right? And it ends up exacerbating itself and metastasizing anyway from within, and so it doesn't help, right? The structure that's created there, it might have appeared to serve some purpose, and maybe it did serve some purpose back then, but right now in this moment it's not helping, it's not serving anything at all. And the unwillingness or the apparent incapacity in the moment to stop and look and examine the whole movement of this piece of thought, the mechanical structure, the physical structure of this piece of thought, the inability or the lack of desire to look at it comes from the reaction to fear, the reaction to anger, the reaction to whatever the emotion. But the emotional reaction prevents one from simply being able to stand back, create some distance between oneself and what you actually are, right, oneself, and this traumatic structure, and therefore to be able to perceive the mechanism disallows healing. Because in order to heal, in order to actually heal from the trauma, you have to stop identifying with it in order that you can take a step back from it, look at it, and you can watch it in motion. Otherwise, if you're identified with it and you're here with it, identified as it, then as it's riding around and going about its, mechanical procedure, and thought is mechanical, the psyche, the ego structure, the personality structure, the trauma structure is mechanical. It's robotic. It's a program. It moves on a fixed track. And that track can be modified, but it's a track, it's a circuit. It always comes back around. It's like the orbit of a planet, even though it might kind of take on a funky roller coaster sort of vibe, and it does, but it's a track like a roller coaster. So, and if you're on it and going on the journey, it's doing its thing, it's going through its cycles of, running from, running toward, right, the chasing, the avoiding, the evading, going to extreme highs and extreme lows, right, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, or avoiding pleasure, seeking pain, or all of the above, right, but there's that cycle, right, the valuation, the devaluation, right, the isolation, and then extreme, right, social presentation, but even in the extreme social presentation, never actually feeling like you're really connecting to anything or anybody, even though you see all the superficial semblances of connection being made. And so even with all the ups and downs and the ups and downs of extremes, highs and lows, inwardly there really still feels to be no change. And so, whether you're alone physically or with somebody physically, that thing is still there. And so, even in the midst of people, there may be some very temporary, superficial kind of connection made, but then as soon as you're, back by yourself again and there's no capacity for distraction, you see, that's still there. And even when you're with people, the fact that it's there prevents you from being able to actually vulnerably and authentically connect in a meaningful way that isn't just a kind of attempt at trauma bonding or self-soothing, which is using the other to not feel lonely, to not feel pained, to not feel depressed or stressed or anxious, right? And so then relationship is really then something about using the other for self-medicating, as opposed to the capacity to simply be open and free and clear and vulnerable in connection. And so, and then so there's always that feeling of getting close and then never being able to quite get it and then coming back and then, right, that eternal dance, which is the trauma. And then so in that kind of a state, the only kind of relationship you'll ever be able to get into is one within the narcissist empath paradigm, right? The narcissist empath paradigm. And see, here's the thing about yin and yang. We like to think of yin and yang as being opposites. They're not opposites. Both yin and yang, both sides, yin and yang, play both parts in equal proportion. One just appears to be playing the yin, one just appears to be playing the yang, but they're both playing both parts simultaneously. And so in the narcissist empath relationship, the narcissist is also an empath. That's why they're so emotionally intelligent. And the empath is also a narcissist. That's why they are codependent, psychologically dependent upon being seen as good, being seen as nice, being seen as accommodating, being seen in an appropriate light by not just the narcissist that they're in the direct relationship with, but by everybody else in their world. And the narcissist has the same struggle. If you've ever really had a real conversation, an emotional conversation with somebody who's clearly playing that kind of narcissistic role in the relationship in the narcissist empath paradigm, they will tell you that one of their deepest fears is other people thinking bad thoughts about them, despite the fact that they run around causing hell for everybody, but in themselves they deeply feel themselves to be good, right? Because they know what they are deeply on a soul level, if I may use that word. But their true self, right? They know deeply that they're hurt, that they're wounded, and they're mechanically caught in this cycle, and they're trying, just like you are if you're the empath, right, in that particular equation. And so the narcissist has that same psychological situation. They do not want other people to think bad thoughts about them or to have a negative image of them, right? Because they have a terribly negative image of themselves, even though with all the pomp and the it looks like they're very confident. People would actually say cocky. It's not real confidence. Comes off as a cockiness, right? But it's a projection. And so the narcissist empath paradigm, both are projecting. You see, the transcendence of the empath narcissist paradigm is compassion, you see? And so the empath is always lamenting, oh, I'm always taking in people's energy, and I'm just so sensitive, and I can't be around people because I just feel everything too much. Well, the narcissist is also hyper aware of people's emotions and what's going on in that kind of field. And their nervous systems are often very overstimulated as well. They might hide it a little bit better, at least verbally, vocatively, than the one who's on the empath, identified as the empath. But the empath is doing the exact same thing as the narcissist. They're projecting from their own memory, from their own experience, out onto other people, as opposed to there being a completely direct awareness of what is the way it is. Right? Because if that's compassion. Compassion is the transcendence, because compassion is a totally raw, complete, unfiltered perception of what is the way it is, which cannot be there as long as there's still a nexus core of trauma stuck in the psyche as the gravitational, planetary, right? The gravitational nexus of the psychological system, right? And as long as there is still trauma in one's identity, right, as long as one is still traumatized or in that trauma, as we'd say, that is the gravitational center of the psychological movement that one considers to be one's ego, one's personality, one's identity, one's self, one's social self, whatever terminology that you're comfortable using or that you do use in your practical life. And so as long as that's there, you can only project. And this is something that really has to be seen. As long as you are wounded, you can only project. You're not capable of clear seeing because you're identified with the wound, with the story around the wound, and trying to protect that wound, and therefore your intellectual, your psychological attention is split. Part of it may be looking out here and gleaning information, gathering, but the other part of it is trying to protect this wound. And as long as the attention is divided and split between protecting the wound, keeping the wound safe, and trying to do some kind of activity out here, in any way the attention that is focused outwardly will also itself be split in the outside world. And so with that split attention, whether you want to call it, being on the empath side or the narcissist side, it's the same thing. It's split attention. It's split, divided here, and then it's divided out here, and it's even divided in here. And with that kind of divided attention, there's no consciousness, there's no compassion. What we mean by consciousness, compassion, peace, love, joy. It's not possible. There may be temporary pleasure, temporary elation, temporary giddiness, right? But not actual joy, not actual love. Because in the narcissist empath relationship, there isn't love, there's codependence, and there's projection. And a using of one another to re-wound and re-traumatize each other daily, right? And so that's the cycle. That's the cycle. And so compassion is the transcendence. And there's no possible way you can get out of this cycle unless you're willing to disidentify with your story, with the trauma that you say is my trauma, my story, to disidentify with it and look at it. To look at the mechanics of it, to watch the physics of it, to actually see how it moves, how it is constantly reborn. Because the trauma, the psychological physics, the system of psychological physics that is running on subconscious autopilot in the brain, most of which is in unconsciousness, cannot continue, that physical system, which is mechanical, cannot continue without conscious effort in the direction of its continuance. And so, and that's part of the trap, that's part of the mechanism, is it feels like it's something that's being done to us, it's something that's just happening to us, but in fact, every day upon waking up, there has to be a conscious recall from memory of the system and an acquiescence to participating in the system, and then therefore going along with the system. And part of that going along with it, the acquiescence, is the story or the belief that I can't do anything about it, this is just who I am, this is just what it is, and this is just where I'm stuck. And so to actually see the whole nature of that mechanical system, one has to take a step back. Has to take a step back. But as long as one feels guilty, and part of staying in that traumatic physical, psychological system is the feeling of guilt. Well, who am I to not suffer? Who am I to not feel that pain? Who am I to not be wounded? Because there's guilt associated with it. There's a sense of camaraderie that you have when you're stuck in the guilt and the shame and the trauma with everybody else who is traumatized, wounded, suffering, right? And so that's the nature of what we call a trauma bond or a wound bond. And so it's painful to pull. I've talked about this before in an older video. If you might go back and watch it. It has the word healing in the title, I think. I might put it in the description below at some point if it becomes necessary, relevant. But, that's part of the physics. You have to be willing to step back. And as long as you are addicted to the guilt, as long as you want to feel guilty, that is, as long as you want to feel like you're getting something out of the suffering and out of the trauma, and this is a really difficult thing to hear. We don't like to hear this, but as long as that suffering and that psychological physic is that mechanical movement of thought, of suffering, of trauma is still operating the way that it's operating, there is still some vested interest in holding on to that identification by the very nature of thought itself. Because thought itself, you build a structure, thought is impermanent. Structures of thought, personal, images created by thought, concepts created by thought relating to oneself and other people, my image of me, your image of me, your image of you, your image of yourself, made of thought. If you see what thought is, it's like sand on a beach. It's there. Thought is thought. It's like an element. And you can take it and shape it into different forms and images and, what we call concepts and ideas. But then it's meant to fall apart. You're not meant to hold on to a consistent image of yourself. You're not meant to have an image of yourself. You're not meant to have an image of anybody because yourself is here. And if you have an image of yourself, you can't actually see your real self because the image is getting in the way. If you have an image of somebody else, you can't see them. The image is getting in the way. And the image is a kind of defense mechanism because you're afraid of what's really there, because you're afraid of what's really here. So when you have an image of yourself that you hold on to, that's part of fear. Making an image and holding on to an image is fear. And that very fear and the image that is made and held on to out of fear, that is the trauma, you see? And so it feeds into itself. It's like a self-feeding system, but it cannot generate its own power. Thought, when the mechanism of thought begins, it kind of turns into what appears to be a perpetual motion machine. But the very subtle perception that has to be seen, and it cannot be seen as long as there's no distance between you and your thought structure. What you don't see is that you actually supply it with the power, with the energy that it requires to go on that apparently perpetual movement of cycling. And because there's a habituation to supplying it with that power, we don't even realize we're doing it. And when it's pointed out, we often get angry and say, well, I wouldn't do that. And that's part of the trauma, that very reaction against facing the fact that we're the one that powers it psychologically. The anger that we feel when that is suggested to us, that's part of the trauma. That's what trauma is. So it's a very clever mechanical system that is literally designed to keep you stuck in it. but you have a choice to exit it by not giving it power, which requires that you create distance between yourself and it. But that requires feeling, because then you have to feel the nature of guilt. You have to feel the nature of shame. You have to feel the nature of trauma. You have to feel the nature of suffering, the nature of hurt, not just in you, but in everybody. And you have to see that it's the same mechanical trap in everybody, not just in you. Whereas before, part of trauma is the belief that this is just me and nobody else knows what this feels like but me, and no one could understand it but me. Every human being feels like that. And in seeing that everybody's caught in that same mechanism, that's what creates the isolated ego, that's what creates narcissism. I'm real and you're not. My suffering's real and yours isn't. I know real suffering, you don't. That's just another kind of superiority contest. Whether you're playing the game of I'm superior or I'm inferior. See, we say that the narcissist, in the narcissist empath paradigm, the narcissist says I'm superior, and the empath says I'm inferior. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. And it all comes from projection revolving around that same core wound. And so in the relationship, we'll say this is the yang, this is the yin. Both yang and yin are both yang and yin. That's why in the yin-yang symbol, the black and the white side, on the white side you have the black dot, on the black side you have the white dot. People in their simplistic understanding will say, well, that means that in the good there's a little bit of bad, and in the bad there's a little bit of the good. That's not what it means at all. It's a flat two-dimensional symbol, which is actually a depiction of something that's in dynamic motion. What it's showing you is that both sides play both parts equally. Yang and yin play both yang and yin. The sub and the dom are both sub and dom. So when you're in confusion, the one who thinks they're the dom, I know I'm using this kind of an example now, I hope you're okay. The one who thinks they're the dom, I'm the dom and you're my sub, and it's like, whoa, 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 that's just violence, that's just rape, that's just, you understand what I'm saying? That's insensitivity. When you're actually, if you're a real, genuine dom, you know that really, under the table, you're the sub. And if you're actually a sub, you know that you're really the dom, right? And so both sides play both parts. Both sides are playing both parts simultaneously. And if you don't consciously know that, then you can't actually play at the highest of levels. You're just stuck perpetuating trauma and trying to practice playing a part instead of actually giving yourself to the play. You see? Big difference. It's like, universe difference. It's not even close to being the same thing. So you have to understand that both sides are playing both parts simultaneously. Otherwise, it wouldn't even connect. It wouldn't even connect. It's like in the when you go into the shamanic realm, right? And you start talking about that, and people will talk about attachments, entity attachments, or demonic attachments, right? That sort of thing. Forgive the language if you don't care for it, but it's words that are meant to refer to just a mechanical structure of attachment, which is, you could call it trauma, using psychological language, whatever. They're just different ways of conceptualizing it. But nothing can stick to you that you're not a fit for. That's a fact. If you are not a fit, if you're not people will say if you're not a vibrational match, but if you're not a mechanical fit for the piece, for the attachment, it can't attach to you. If I don't have a port opening, if I don't have a porthole on me, then the jack that would fit into that porthole, there's nowhere for it to land, there's nowhere for it to stick. Do you see what I'm saying? And so the narcissist empath paradigm, they're able to do that dance because they are one another. They're mirror images of one another. But we play the game of, oh, the poor empath and oh, the evil narcissist. They're the same thing. They're the exact same thing. They're just not, they're pretending they're not. One is going, I'm yang, and the other is going, I'm yin. Both yin and yang are both yin and yang simultaneously. Both sides play both parts simultaneously. But in the skewed dance that's happening out of the fact of trauma, because trauma is distortion. Trauma creates a skew. It creates a skewed image of oneself, a skewed perception of oneself, and all images are skewed. That's what an image is, but it creates a skewed perception of oneself and a skewed perception of other. And so one gets off on the idea that they're playing this role, and the other gets off on the idea that they're playing this role. They're both playing the same role simultaneously, pretending they're not. not. And that is the very perpetuation of the traumatic cycle. And so the only way to end it is to end it, which means you have to back off completely and be alone totally and completely in this moment, inwardly. Because then you have to see that what you thought was out here is not out there, it's in here. You are both simultaneously. You are both yin and yang simultaneously. And if you actually see that, and you get really clear about what that movement is, then that arising of what we've come to call integration takes place, or begins to take place. And you discover that there actually were never two, there was always one, and it was always right here in you. What you are is whole. It's not split, it's not fragmented. But the you that you are psychologically is split, is fragmented. And that's not the real you. It's an image that was created out of the trauma. Because trauma is an image. It's image transfer. It's psychological image transfer. So, and you can't see this. You can't see it at all unless you're willing to step back. And you cannot step back as long as there's the emotional clinging to the codependent situation. And that includes the need to continue to see yourself as playing a certain part. Some people are addicted to seeing themselves as I'm the empath, or I'm the feminine, or I'm the masculine, or I'm the this, or I'm the that. It's like, no, you're all of it. As long as you are invested in identifying with a certain part or a certain aspect, you're too frightened to let go of that aspect in case it doesn't come back, which shows your insecurity about your identity. Unless you're willing to let go of the part that you're particularly clinging to and identified with, in order to simply stand here open, free, raw, and vulnerable, without any shield, without anything used as a barrier to keep you safe, only then, in that total freedom, in that total openness, in that total expanded awareness then of self, can you actually come into the direct realization of who and what you really are. What you then see is, from a psychologically in terms of the fragmentation, is both the empath and the narcissist. You're both at once. But then when you actually allow that shield, and those are shields, they both block the real thing from being present. And when you actually let that go and you take a step back and you, with fearlessness and courage, let the structure go that you're using to keep yourself safe and identify with, then you end up simply coming back home to what you are. You just stand here in the open, raw, radiant, unfiltered, unfettered, unparticulated, unaspected, whole, complete, total version of yourself, which you see totally transcends all of the psychological paradigm. What you are, and that's called compassion, that total openness of just pure, clear seeing without obstruction, within or without, that's compassion. And in that you see, oh my God, we're all doing the same thing to ourselves and to each other, and we don't even realize it. We're pretending we're not. We're all pretending that we're stuck in our own little island of pain and suffering, but we're all in that same situation of feeling. And it's the exact same virus, pretending to be so many different things. And so as long as you keep that division up of I'm the empath and they're the narcissist, it's like then you're still caught in your own narcissism, because the empath is a narcissist and the narcissist is an empath. They're both. But if you take the social pretense, if you take the superficial pretense to be real, because they're saying all these things, that's the part, right? You can't take the words, you can't take the superficial expression at face value. You have to, and you can't see what it actually is beneath the surface unless you're willing to take a step back. But as long as you're identified and you're right up here with it, because you're caught in it, you're enamored with it, you like the part that you have to play in it, because it makes you feel substantiated in some way, or good in some way, or superior in some way, or superiorly inferior in some way, whatever the game you're playing psychologically keeps you attached, and that's part of the trauma. It's part of the trauma, and so that's what keeps you hooked and attached into playing that role, even though on the other hand you go, I want to get out, I'm done with this fucking sucks, I hate it, but you love it. You're still getting something out, and so until you're willing to actually detach completely and step back and look, and then you see, oh fuck, that's me. It's me. It's me. How could it be anybody else but me? You have to agree to play the game. And you don't agree to play the game if it's not on your fucking radar. if you don't have any corresponding plugs, if you don't have any corresponding, jack sockets, you understand what I'm saying? If you don't have any corresponding, fitting pieces, then you don't even play the game. It doesn't even come across the attention of your conscious radar. It's just like, it doesn't even click as a viable, It's like, if you don't eat a certain kind of food, and you just don't eat that food, you don't even flirt with it, you just don't eat it, right? Then when you see it, it doesn't even register in your brain as food, right? When you go to the store and you're like walking through, the laundry detergent aisle, it doesn't clock in your brain, oh, that's a potential food item. It just doesn't, right? Or that's a nice beverage. It doesn't even clock. Because 100%, right? There's a 100% perception that that's not a food item. Because there's no corresponding, there's not even a single percent of a desire. And so the only way to, and this is where, it becomes a little bit tricky, not tricky, but difficult to hear, is that there has to be a 100% commitment, 100% resolve to the fact that the perception that what you are is not that, or that you don't want that, right? Because what you are, obviously, then is seen to be the open, clear, radiant, free consciousness, which is the compassion, which is the transcendence of the empath narcissist paradigm. But as long as there's if you're only 99% resolved to, I don't want to do that dance anymore, if there's even a 1% allowance in your in your brain, in your desire, a 1% allowance in your desire, to still maybe dip your toe in there, you're going to go right back into it. There has to be a 100% resolve to not even see that as a viable, it's not even relationship. And that's the truth, is that when you're in the narcissist empath paradigm, which is obviously where 90% plus of the humanity is in their current relationship structure, that's not real relationship. That's practice relationship. You see, which isn't real. Practice isn't the real thing. It's like this. See, I speak Spanish among a few other languages, and when I have some friends that speak Spanish from different places, and we chat. When we chat, and we might switch between language, whatever, but we chat. And I know people. There are sometimes when I'll encounter people who will begin speaking Spanish and they don't know me, right? And they'll sometimes make a comment like, oh, yeah, it's really nice practicing Spanish with you, or it's nice that you want to practice your Spanish. And it's like, I'm not practicing, I'm communicating with you. I'm communicating. I have something to say and I'm saying it, and I'm saying it clearly. We're not practicing, right? And so the real thing is not practice. That's the point. But people when you want to keep a distance from something, you practice. It's like, so-called practicing an instrument. You can't practice an instrument, you're playing. You might not be playing well, but you're playing. You're not practicing. When you sit down at the piano, or you sit down at the cello, or you pick up the trumpet, or it doesn't matter what it is, the flute, you're playing. You're playing. You're not practicing. You're playing, right? You don't practice anything. You play. You do it. Practice relationship is not relationship. That's just mutually agreed upon violence. It's not relationship. So, but we call it relationship, and because the 90% plus, it's much higher than that. It's more like 97%. It's really high. Most people are in that kind of play, not that fake relationship. Because as long as you're still in that physics of trauma, in the narcissist empath paradigm, you're not in real relationship with anybody, not even with yourself, not consciously. When relationship is unconscious and still being governed by the subconscious mechanism, that's not relationship. That's a hostage situation. And most everybody is invested in because that's the nature of trauma. It keeps it, that the psychological, the physical mechanism of trauma keeps itself, right? As we looked at, the energy, the conscious attention, the split attention, right, of energy is what goes into it and keeps it running. Split attention is what keeps it running. That's inattention. So ignorance of self is what keeps it running. And one chooses that ignorance of self in order to keep it running because there's a fear, because it's the known. And when it stops and there's simply the void, the vast openness, which is the unknown, one says, I'm frightened of that unknown. But really, the unknown, you can't be afraid of the unknown. You're afraid of the known, which you're projecting into the unknown. You can never be afraid of the unknown. There's no such thing as fear of the unknown. Never. You're afraid of the known because the known is fear. You see? And the known, which is fear, projects itself into the void, into the darkness, into the blankness, what appears to be blankness, but it's not actually blank. It only looks blank because the attention is split. And so the only way to find out what the void actually is, the only way to find out what the unknown actually is, you have to put your 100% attention onto it. And you can't do that as long as the trauma nucleus is still the gravitational center of one's psychological mechanism, which is having any sustained psychological mechanism at all. Because a true psychological mechanism built and engaged with in consciousness will then immediately be sent back into the raw elemental substratum of thought the minute you're done with it. That means it's allowed to dissolve back into the void. You see? You don't then, in perpetuity, drag a psychological mechanism through your life. You drop it. You build something out of thought. You use thought as the basic tool that it is, and when you're done with the thought structure, and you build a thought structure so that you can do something with it out here. And the minute you do that, you drop it, you let go of it. So you use thought as the blueprint in order to build, to do something out here, and then that goes, and then the thought goes. You don't solidify or concretize the thought structure. But the ignorance which causes you to want to solidify the thought structure, which is wanting to have psychological security, right? That's trauma. Trauma wants psychological security. There is no psychological security. There's no psychological concretization because you're not your thought. You're not the psychological structure. But if you think you're the psychological structure, that is trauma. The ego is trauma, and trauma is violence. And the trauma, violence, ego, that is the narcissist empath paradigm. And it's both the empath and the narcissist. But empath really means projection. You're projecting your experience-based knowledge of emotional connectivity or emotional awareness, which isn't real emotional awareness. It's not genuine emotional awareness. The only genuine awareness is compassion, and compassion is aware of the formlessness of its own self, the formlessness of no thought, the formlessness of no trauma, the formlessness of peace, of love, of joy, and it's aware totally of the mechanical nature of thought, the mechanical nature of the traumatic nucleus of gravity, and the whole psychological mechanism that moves around it. And it's aware of it actually as it is, not through projection. And so it knows not to exacerbate it, it knows not to touch it. And in fact, compassion can never touch it, you see? Compassion observes it, but for the formless, you see, but formlessness, it doesn't touch it. And in the simple observation of it without touching it, when it arises, it takes its form, it takes its shape, it runs through its mechanical dance, its mechanical movement, and then it simply falls away and dissolves back into the void, you see? And so compassion is the transcendence precisely because compassion allows for everything to express itself and then fall away, be done, die, dissolve back into a primal state, which isn't some disordered chaos, which is the fear projected by thought, projected by the trauma, projected by the known. The reality of the primal state is peace. Peace. That's the reality of it, but you can't know that directly for yourself unless you're willing to step away from that nucleus, from that narcissist empath paradigm. And that requires the willingness to see that it's not just you, that you're not alone in it, but that's the trap of it. And you have to do that final leap, that final jump completely alone. Unless you happen to find someone who's made the leap and who lives in that compassion, and they can hold your hand, physically perhaps while you're going through it, but you still have to go through that inward movement alone You see? And so anyway, you have to go through that alone, inwardly, because you have to, it's called stepping into sovereignty. So you have to detach from any kind of narrative or any kind of desire for codependence. And so it takes everything you've got. It takes 100% resolve, 100% dedication, and the willingness to go beyond the known. The willingness to go beyond your limitation, your psychological limitation, which you've set up in order to keep yourself safe from whatever you think is lurking outside. But the demon, the monster, is not, the hurt, the suffering is not lurking outside, it's within. You trapped it inside the walls. You know, and so that thing that you're afraid of is actually within. It's coming from inside the house. You know, it's inside of the structure that you've built to keep yourself safe. So you built a wall in order to keep the enemy out, or to keep the villain out, or to keep the intruder out. But in building the wall, you just locked yourself inside with the intruder. You know, and you are that, and the you that you feel yourself to be, separate from the world, is that intruder. You see, but then the split-mindedness causes you to think there's two in there when there's really just one. And because you built the wall, you're just stuck in there with yourself. And then you think, why are my thoughts so mean? Why is my brain so mean to me? Why is my anxiety doing this to me? Why is my depression doing this to me? But the I, the you that says, why is my thought doing this to me, is the thought. The you that says, why is my depression doing this to me, is the depression. The you that says, why is my brain being so mean to me, is the brain. You see, it is that, but the inattention makes it appear to be me and the depression, me and the brain, me and the thought, me and the trauma. The you that says that is the trauma. And so that's the trap. That's why it said, you know, don't identify. You have to step back from identification. Otherwise, you stay stuck in it, and then you can only ever project outward and blame the other. If you're the empath, you blame the narcissist. And if you're the narcissist, you blame the empath. And that's just how that's the cycle. And so it will keep going into perpetuity until you finally say, I'm not feeding it anymore. I'm stepping back, no matter what happens. And it will feel like you're going to die, because you're stepping outside of the stronghold you've built for yourself. And so you have to go through that gateway of death. You have to go through that feeling of, I'm going to fucking die. And it will overwhelm your whole body, like a panic attack, perhaps. That's you know, your whole being will feel like it's being ripped apart. And you have to lean into that feeling. You'll feel like you're being crushed, because that's the feeling of the whole psychological system, which you've been totally identified with, just falling apart, cracking up and falling apart completely. And you don't try to hold on to it or salvage it or piece it back together, or even try to hold on to one little bit of it in your pocket. You have to let the whole thing go and the whole thing dissolve and the whole thing fall apart. Otherwise, you stay stuck in it. You can't even save a little piece of it, because that piece will be a seed that'll simply regrow the whole old system. That's how it works. That's how the physics of psyche works. And so you have to let the whole thing fall apart and go without trying to save it or salvage it. Because what are you trying to save it and salvage it for? So that the people who are a traumatic fit for that system will stick around you? Yeah. And so when you just let the whole thing go and fall apart, and you just return to just being here, and you have to, but that's why it's called an initiation. Or this is the movement that is required for a human being to step into sovereignty and maturity. And this was, you could say, one of the final rites of passage in all ancient cultures, you know, because you have to go through that breaking, that total release of the psychological structure, the traumatic psychological structure, which is wrapped around having an individual identity as this aspect versus that aspect, right? And so it's only in the release of that, it's leaving the known behind completely. And so it's the equivalent of, like, you know, like the old, you know, stories of the myths and the heroes, and, you know, or like the young wizard, whatever it is, you know, the adventurer, right, having to leave behind everything that they know and everything they're attached to go off on that journey, not knowing if they're ever going to come back. And it's almost like the feeling of, you know, going off into space, or getting on a ship and going across the ocean, you know, before cell phones, before electronics, before all of that, not knowing if you're ever going to come back and see anything again. But if you want to find out what you want to find out, if you actually want to be free, then you have to be willing to let go of the entire known completely, knowing that you may never come back to that old land again. And so that's the feeling, and that feeling has to be gone through. And it shakes up again. It's a letting go. It's an allowance of the natural physical process of the mind to take place anyway. Because when the physics of the mind is not messed with, anyway, the structures that are built of thought arise, they do their mechanical dance because it is mechanical, and then it falls away, it dissolves. And the problem with the narcissist empath paradigm, the traumatized nucleus that the psychological physics is doing its dance around, that stays, and the very pain of that is the fact that this whole system, when it arises, it's supposed to be allowed to flower and then just dissolve. But you keep it running in perpetuity by splitting your attention. And so you're disallowing the mind to actually follow its natural flow. And the natural flow, the natural physics of psyche demands that it does what it does. The structure is built in accordance with the immediate need, and then when that need is done, it's finished. You let that structure dissolve. You don't go dragging it around. But the very nature of the trauma is the dragging of it around. And so to finally let it all go, if you're very, very addicted and hooked to that, which you are, if you're caught in that cycle, then it feels like death. It literally feels like death. Literally. It feels like death. And you have to be willing to die. You have to actually be willing to experience that death. Totally. And you'll feel it in your body, totally viscerally. And so it actually feels like, okay, I'm going to die. I'm going to lay down and die. And I'm okay with that. I surrender to that. Because you see that that's the only way to freedom. And you know, okay, the body might not die, but you can't know that. You have to go through the feeling. And so it'll feel like the body and the mind are just being totally overwhelmed by everything all at once. And you have to lean into that and let that feel you. And trust that you have the capacity to bear it, to handle it, and make it through, because you do. It's only you telling yourself that you don't. Because it literally overwhelms you. There's no part of you that isn't hypersaturated with some kind of, movement or some kind of intensity. Yes, exactly, that's it. It literally, it's trying to break you apart. Because it has to. That's the only way out. You have to experience being broken apart completely and not trying to salvage the pieces. People say, I've been broken and I'm going to salvage the pieces. Fuck that. Don't salvage the damn pieces. That's the poison. You're supposed to be broken apart and let the pieces dissolve. Let them fade back into the sands of time. You're not to salvage the pieces. There's no pieces to salvage. You see? What you are is the vast openness of the emptiness of the space. You are the empty space, but the empty space is full. It's vibrant. It's just pure, raw being. It's peace. It's love. It's compassion. It's joy. It's intelligence. It's raw perception of what is, of life. It's life itself. And you can't know that. You can't know that that's what the unknown is. You can't know that that's what the void is. You can't know that that's what the vast openness of space is until you give yourself to it, which you can't if you're still hooked on staying safe within the bubble world of trauma, within that little nucleus of trauma. And so even though we say we hate the trauma and we don't want to be in there, we actually choose to be in there because the alternative means stepping out into the infinite expanse of space, of eternity, of the void. And we're terrified of it. But we're only terrified of it because we project the trauma's idea of what's out there onto it. But what trauma is actually afraid of is not out there in the unknown, it is in itself. Trauma is what it's afraid of. Trauma is afraid of itself. But it says what I'm afraid of is out there. No, it's right here, it's in here. You see? And so when you actually see it, it's like, oh my God, it's so silly, it's so ridiculous, it's so stupid, it's so stupid. And when you see how stupid it is, it's like, oh my God, I should have gotten rid of that years ago. It's so stupid. But that's the liberation. But when you don't see that, when you're in it, it's anything but stupid. It's the only thing that's real when you're caught in it. But when you're out of it, finally you go, oh my God, I was such a waste. That's a waste of time. Not just me, but everyone and the whole of humanity for the last thousands of years, just wasting our time. Like, what is this ridiculousness? Suffering's a waste of time. It's a waste of time. Being wounded is a waste of time. And we choose to keep it going. And if you just come up and say that to somebody who's in it, you know you're choosing that one. That's cruel. You know what, they're not ready to, but you have, because you have to walk through it. You have to see it. If someone just comes up to you and says, you know, you choose your suffering, you know, is it true? Yes, of course, because you see it now. But if you're caught in it, does it help to hear that? Maybe if you're right on the fucking edge, but not if you're like, you know, in it. No, that doesn't fucking help. So you see, that's the trap of trauma, is that like the key out, the way out is the way that nobody wants to go. You see, the way out, the way through it is that one that you don't want to hear, that you don't want to go, and so it's the perfect fucking trap. But at the same time, it's so fucking stupid. It's the stupidest thing. You see? It's the most clever and the most stupid thing at once. And it's just like, oh my God. You know, when you see it, and then you see that it wasn't real. What's real is compassion. What's real is the vast openness of being. That's what's real, not yes. So this has to be seen, and this has to be gone through. And that means, so you can't avoid feeling at anything. And so you do, that's the initiation. And that's what all the religious stories are about. Whether it's Buddha and his enlightenment, or Christ on the cross, or Shiva, Krishna, it doesn't, pick anyone. Odin hanging on the tree of Yggdrasil, winning the runes. That's what this is about. You have to feel every last drop of suffering from the beginning to the end of time all at once. You have to literally feel everything that a human being could possibly feel all at once. That's the feeling, and you have to just let it take you. You have to just let it crush you. You can't run away from it, because you see it's the only way out. The only way out is to feel everything all at once. You can't say, if you're saying, no, I'm going to feel a little bit today and a little bit tomorrow and a little bit next week, that's the practice that we are talking about. That's just you working up the courage to do it. But when you do it, you have to actually do it. You have to swallow it whole. You have to take the whole thing at once, 100% all at once. You can't take 90% and then 2% and then 5% or 10% and 10 and 20. You have, even if you take 99% yesterday, that you don't just get to say, okay, then I'll roll it over into the last 1% tomorrow. You have to take 100% at once, or it will never happen. That's the truth. That's how it works. That's the only way out. You have to do 100% at once, or it will not. It just doesn't. You just end up modifying it and creating more and more coping mechanisms and becoming more and more numb. You become more and more addicted and habituated to whatever you're addicted and habituated to. You have to feel the whole thing 100% all at once, or nothing at all might as well have been done. So it takes total courage and total bravery. It takes a complete resolve. You can't be duplicitous. You can't have any. There's no two ways about it. You can't be split about it. You can't want to play with yourself. You can't want to play a game with yourself about it. You have to be totally sincere and totally resolved. So it's it's what you're here for. Because when you do it for yourself, you help do it. You elevate everybody in doing it. You see, when you do it, not only does it set you free, but it increases the capacity, the possibility for everybody else to do it. And so to actually do this, to go through this, is not only our right, it's our right as a being to know this freedom and to know this truth, to know the compassion, the truth of who and what we really are, and to be free of the trauma and the suffering, and to see its nature. It's not only our right, but it's our responsibility as human beings upon this planet who are positioned in this capacity of stewardship. Because you can't be a steward of anything if you're still caught in that. You can't be a steward of your own body. You can't be a steward of your own mind, of your own energies. You can't be a steward of other people. You can't be a steward of land. You can't be a steward of life if you're still caught in that trauma. You just can't. You can't. It's not possible. It's not possible. Otherwise, you'll just spread it. Because as long as the trauma is there, it just keeps spreading like a virus. And so you have a right and a responsibility to end it. Completely to end it. And that's not the ending, that's the beginning. It's the ending of the old and the beginning of the new. But then when you're in the new, when you're in compassion, when you're in just this grand openness, then what that is, you see, is not only formless, spaceless, timeless, but it's constantly new. It's constantly refreshed. And then you can do what you like with thought. You can build a structure and then happily watch it be, rent back into the void. Because you see the nature of thought. So you're not afraid of losing thought. You're not afraid of losing your mind anymore. Because you see the mind is meant to be lost. The mind is meant to be lost. Because what you are is not that temporary structure. Which you see that the world and its whole living in its traumatic mechanism insists that you are the structure, right? You are the name, you are the body, you are the, right? You are the story. No, you're not. No, you're not. No, you're not. You're not. You're not. You're not. You're not. And until you get that, don't wait for the world to get it. The world's not going to get it until you get it. If you're waiting for the world or for somebody else to get it before you get it, you're never going to get it. You have to get it, whether anybody else gets it or not. And that's the freedom. And then in your stepping into freedom, and you claiming and you returning to your sovereignty, and you coming back home to the truth of who and what you really are, which is totally innocent, never been touched, never can be touched, totally free, vibrant, joyful, peaceful, compassionate, which means you have the capacity to bear anything and everything, which you've already demonstrated to yourself. It's already been revealed to you, because to step back into the truth of who you are, you have to go through the ordeal of literally bearing every last ounce of suffering, every last scrap of suffering from the beginning to the end of time. That's the ordeal of the feeling of the bearing of it all that you have to go through in order to step out of it. You have to bear it all and see that you have the capacity to bear it all and the entirety of the infinity of consciousness itself, which is infinitely greater than that little trauma. But as long as you're in that trauma, in the suffering, it feels like the whole cosmos. It feels like it's bigger than the universe. It feels like it's bigger than you. But actually, you're infinitely bigger than it. And the only way to have that correction in perception is the willingness to feel it all at once without cutting it up into bits and pieces. You have to feel it all at once. You have to swallow it whole. You have to let it completely flood you and overwhelm you, and not back away, not run away, not fight it, not suppress it. And it'll feel like death. And you have to be willing to go through that gateway, to walk through that portal, in order to find out, to move through the shadow of the valley of death, to put it like that, in order to know it. You have to be willing to walk through that door, that gateway. And when you do, you see there was no door, there was no gateway, there was no portal. There's no gateway, there's no door. That's just what it looks like. Because what is omnipresent. What is everywhere all at once. And so there's only the appearance of moving through a door. There's only the appearance of moving through a gateway. And so you look like you're moving through a door, and as soon as you go through the door, you look back, there's no door. There never was a door. It's like, oh my God, that's a part of the moving, that's a part of the trauma, that's a part of the projection. The split attention. And so, when you really talk about it, it comes off as a kind of a paradox, but when you actually perceive it in the raw, there's no paradox at all. It's so simple and clean. It's so clear. It's just... There's nothing you can do but laugh and cry, So, this is what has to be done. And every human being has to. This isn't just you. Everybody must. This is a requirement for being a human being. Every human being that steps into truth, that steps into clear perception, that steps into, what you would call psychological maturity or spiritual maturity or just maturity as a human being, has to go through this. And then you see that maturity as a being has nothing to do with society's measurings or markers or yardsticks. Had you checked off all the markers, the boxes that society has declared makes a human being a human being? That's not what makes a human being. What makes a human being is your capacity to feel and to bear everything. The willingness to return home to your true nature, which is the very essence of the source of creation itself, which is the love, which is the compassion, which is the joy, which is the peace, which is not, none of that is sentimental. The false thing is sentimental. The thing created by ego, created by trauma, is the sentimental thing. And so trauma thinks it knows what love is. It thinks it knows what peace is. It thinks it knows what joy is. It doesn't. It just, trauma's idea of love is just trauma. Trauma's idea of peace is just suppression, which is more violence, more trauma. You see, trauma doesn't know what compassion is. Trauma thinks that compassion is pity, which is just arrogance. You see? Because trauma is arrogance, you know? And so thinking that it knows what it doesn't know. It's ignorance disguised as knowing, as awareness. And so it's just, when you see it, it's just, and when you actually see it, what you have is compassion. Because the only thing to do is to be in compassion. That doesn't, compassion's not pity. Pity is a terrible emotion. Pity is arrogance. Pity is violence. Pity is not helpful. Neither self-pity nor pity of another. But compassion lets you see, not only can I bear it, can I feel it, can I hold it, can I suffer it, but I see that I must bear it. That doesn't mean you walk around all the time. It means you have to, for an instant, if you actually for just one instant feel it all completely, bear it all completely, then what happens is it moves right through you and it's done. And it just goes right back to the void. It goes right back and you go, oh fuck, I can actually bear anything. I can actually handle anything. There's nothing I can't handle. But it's the trauma that says, I can't handle it, I can't handle it. That's the trap, that's the trick. And as long as the tension is divided and split anyway, you can't handle it, you know? Just physically, just the physics. But it's a choice to be in the split attention because you think that you're still going to get something out of staying in this place. And you're not. Finally, if you wise up, if you get clear, you see there's nothing to gain from here. There's nothing to gain from this. Nothing to gain from it. Nothing. There's no real safety there. There's no real security. There's the pretense of safety and security here, but there's no safety or security there actually. And so to actually see that is like, okay, the only option, the only choice, and so it's called choiceless, because the only choice literally is to go beyond. That's the only choice, and that requires the feeling of everything. All at once. And that's stepping into being human. That's really stepping into your capacity as a sovereign, as a full human being, as a fully realized human being. And then you see that what we are is that space, is that pure, open, eternal, formless, borderless, boundaryless space, which is not whatever trauma had projected onto it, but it is intelligence, it is love, it is compassion, it is peace, it is ecstasy, it is joy. And then you don't go around, making fun of people. It's like, no, stop it. When someone's hurt, they're hurt. You don't make fun of somebody who's hurt. No? You don't mock pain. You don't mock suffering. Because then mocking it that's what it is. It's a thing of mockery. Trauma, it's a thing of mockery. And so mocking it is just being in it. And so you don't need to mock, don't need to mimic, don't need to imitate, don't need to make fun of. Just need to be. As you are in your natural state, which is always here, always untouched, always unbroken, always free. Always love, always peace, always compassion. But the real thing, not the contrived idea that trauma projects. Because that's not the real thing. The real thing is always here, but you can't know what it is unless you're willing to drop all of that, to let that dissolve, to go beyond it. I hope this has been helpful. And it's vital. It's vital. Obviously, it's life. All right. Breathe with me for a second, if you would. uh, sit up a little straight, if you would. It's really, really good for the lungs to just be open. Don't overly puff the chest out. That's not so great on the back. Um, but it's really nice to have the organs in the chest just not crushed, just nice and open, expanded. Shoulders relaxed. You put your hands on your knees. Everything kind of just naturally falls into place here. You can have your hands cupped on your knees if you'd like. If you turn your hands over so that the palms are facing up, the lower lobe of your lungs actually open up. You can go ahead and experiment with that on your own if you'd like. But palms facing down, you end up breathing from the middle lobe of your lung. Palms facing up, you end up breathing from the lower lobe of your lung. Head, face slightly upturned. And breathe in through the nose. Hold it for a minute. Out through the nose. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the nose. In through the nose. Hold. And out through the mouth. Now in your own time, just take a few deep, slow breaths. Hold for a couple seconds at the top before you release, and release as consciously as you can. Everything that we just went over together, it can only be done now. Suffering, trauma, never ends in the future. And never starts in the past. It starts and stops now. It can only begin now, and it can only end now. Suffering can only end now. It can only end now. Yes. Well, peace be with you. May you know yourself as that open, vast, infinite, eternal, compassionate space. And may you be free, be free, be free, be free, be free, be free, be free. You are free. You're free. You're free. Love. Peace.